we're actually very excited to have Yasmin Purba over here, who's flown in all the way from Indonesia to be here for the conference. So thank you very much for coming down. Thank you to Ben for agreeing to do this conversation with Yasmin. And we've had Yasmin also write blogs for us on the recent developments in Indonesia. Yasmin's blog is accessible on the SOAS website, but also if you wanted to read it in the original Bahasa, you could read it on the QA blogs on the QA website. So Yasmin is a human rights lawyer and an expert on who offers formal legal representation for LGBTI communities in Indonesia, and she's also an activist. And she'll be talking with Dr. Ben Murtagh today about the recent developments in Indonesia around the persecution of gay men, but also the moral panic that has seemed to have gripped the country for quite a while now. And Dr. Ben Murtagh, who by now everyone should be quite familiar with, is the head of department for South and Southeast Asia here at SOAS and works on Indonesian film and cinema with a specific focus on LGBTI, lesbian and warrior identities. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Yasmin, thank you very much indeed for coming today. We're always extremely pleased to have a guest from Indonesia. We don't get so many. It's a long way away, and I'm really pleased to see a big crowd here today. So many of us will be familiar to a certain extent with this idea that there's been a bit of a moral panic, I guess we could say, in Indonesia in recent times. So I wonder if you could just start off by giving us a bit of an overview, in your opinion, of what's been happening in Indonesia in the last year and a half.
Sure. Thank you, Ben. Let me just check the microphone. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I would like to thank you all for coming to this session. And I'm a bit surprised that there's so many people have interest in the situation in Indonesia. But it is true that Indonesia is now it's unprecedented what happened in Indonesia towards the LGBT people. That of course the situation of LGBTI community in Indonesia is we are never secure or protected. We always have problems and we always face stigmas of being sinners or deviants. But it was not until last year, at least, in 2016, that hostilities against LGBT community became so widespread. I'm a member of Arus Pelangi. If some of you have heard, the Arus Pelangi is one of the prominent LGBT rights advocacy organization, and we conducted a monitoring on the situation in 2016. There were at least more than 160 cases of attacks in forms of hate speech, forced evictions of warrior trans women and gay men. In 2016, I conducted a training on the access to justice for LGBT people in Jakarta, and halfway through the training, the hotel management came into the room and told us that there were many policemen in the lobby. They're asking the management to dismiss the meeting because, well, according to them, they were asked by this infamous Islamic fundamentalist group called the Islamic Defender Front, or we call it FBI, and they asked the police to dismiss the meeting, or they will dismiss themselves with violence. So instead of protecting us, the police forced us and the hotel management to dismiss the training. And it was very ironic because we were having a training on access to justice for LGBTI people in Indonesia. So that's how like the overall situation. There were of course instances of similar incidents. In 2009, there was a dismissal of ILGA conference in Surabaya, but the number had never been so high. 160 cases of attacks against LGBT. It's unprecedented. So I guess I think. And it was the start of what the controversy is. It's a very, I think it was a very why 2016. It was started by a very I don't know trivial, insignificant thing. So there's this support group. There's a group of students and graduate of University of Indonesia. They run these small organizations of support group and research for sexuality, and I forgot the sexuality studies of the University of Indonesia. And they announced their new counseling service for young LGBT people. Somehow, this announcement went viral and picked up by Islamic conservative media that turned it into a controversy. And this media are really obsessed with the LGBT and this group. So they started to interview officials, interview parents, and they basically started spreading fears to the public, basically saying that the propaganda, the LGBT propaganda, has started to infiltrate campuses, and that really raised a lot of fears and concerns among parents. And I think this is the first time, Ben, when and this issue has been really played by many people. Politicians use this to gain sympathy from Muslim voters, and then vigilante groups like fundamentalist groups use this to increase mobilizations, because this is the first time where there is an issue that really unites all Muslims, from moderate, like urban, moderate Muslims to radical Muslim. They never succeeded when they tried to attack the Shia community or the Ahmadiyya community, or I think the main their arch nemesis was Ahmadiyya and Shia, but because only small people really cared what the Ahmadiyya, how the Ahmadiyya practice their religion, or how the Shia practice their religion. But when it comes to LGBT, and with the fear of having their kids infected by the homosexuality viruses, all these people, educated, urban, with well-income families, are united against the LGBT people. And there are a group of academics, conservative academics, filing a petition at the Constitutional Court, basically asking the court to consider homosexuality to be to be a punishable act. And they're also very eager in lobbying and campaigning to encourage the parliament to include criminalization of homosexuality into the new revised penal code. So this is, I think, in terms of movement, we are moving like, I don't know, 10 steps backwards, because before 2016, Arus Pelangi and many other LGBT organizations have always been invited by governments, like institutions. They always consulted policies and regulations, especially with regards to health, sexual health and reproductive rights, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also, we are partners of the ministry because they are always have to answer a lot of questions during many sessions in the UN about LGBT. But after 2016, they just shut off.
Shut you out.
Shut us out. And then,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's very hard in terms of, this is the time when we basically just what do you call it, step back and let as Arus Pelangi as organizations and many LGBT organizations, we rely much on other organizations like women's organizations and human rights organizations to do the advocacy on the front line of the advocacy work, rather than being in the front line like we used to do. So I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So taking a step back, so one of the themes of this conference is the idea of decriminalization. And a point that I made earlier today was that in actual fact, there wasn't anything to decriminalize in Indonesia, because it had never actually, even under the Dutch, apart from for I think 2 or 3 years, when there was it was more of a witch hunt against Dutch homosexuals at the very end of the 1930s, rather than something sort of with, if we call it, the native population at that time. But apart from that, there's never actually been laws against homosexuality in Indonesia. So can you just talk a little bit about, but we have had the laws, we've had the pornography laws and so on from 2008 or 2007, something?
2008.
2008.
Okay.
So can you just tell us a little bit about, so when the police actually go and arrest someone today, what are they actually arresting them for? Because, you know, they haven't broken a law that says you can't be gay or whatever in Indonesia. So what's the offence?
Well, you're right. There is no actual legal basis to arrest us based on our sexual orientation or gender identities. But that's the thing with Indonesian police. They have of course, they corrupt first and foremost, but they also have an excessive power. Like they can just, this is their mentality. It's like they will arrest you first, and then if you are rich enough, they will rip you off to let you go before they're letting you go. Or if the pressure was so big from outside groups, like there's external factors, they'll make up something like what happened to the 140 men who were raided by the police 2 weeks ago.
Yes, this was basically it's a sauna, or it's a private party, a gym, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
And so the police came along, and it wasn't just the fact that these guys were arrested. It was almost the ritualized humiliation of the guys who were arrested, and the fact that pictures of them naked were taken to the police station, and then these were passed around the press and on social media and so on. So in the end, most of them were actually released the following
Yeah,
Dave?
only
Yeah.
10 were charged. 10, I think they were charged under the pornography law because okay. First of all, the victims, they didn't want to be advocated by human rights groups. They were being intimidated by the police, so they decided to just follow the procedure. So the information that we have are very partial, but we heard that we have an information that some are charged for facilitating because in Indonesian criminal law, sex work is not it's not a crime, but what do you call it?
Pimping.
Pimping is. So some are charged for we call it facilitating prostitution, and some are charged for under the pornography law for showing public nudity. I think some of them are the management of the spa, and some of them are the dancers out of the 10.
And how does that work? So, because to my understanding, they're actually arguably in a private space.
Exactly.
But they're being arrested for public nudity. So, is this a different conception of public which also works with what happened in Aceh in a way, with the two guys who were arrested there? They were also in their own home, weren't they?
Yeah, in their room.
So you could argue that was a private space. Does private space exist in Indonesia?
The law is very well. The law says that pornography is displaying pornographic materials in public, but there is no definition of public in the law. So, like the training that I had in a hotel room, in a hotel meeting room, it's a private event, but they said that it was a public event because we invited many people, like 20 people, as participants, and then for this raid, they never actually, the police. We had a lot of we made press releases, we made a lot of complaints about this, but they never really address that specific. We asked for clarification why you raided a private space, but they never really answered that. So there's no clarity in the law itself about what is private, what is a private space and what is a public space. And they always said when it involves a lot of people, then it's public.
I see. And when the police are taking these actions, sometimes it seems to me that the police are almost acting as an independent local group, or is it that there is some sort of central organisation as to what the police are doing, or is it simply one local group of the police in North Jakarta suddenly decides that they're going to take their own independent action?
Well, this is also what happened with the raids of 140 men 2 weeks ago. Also, it was a bit surprising for me in a way, because when it comes to dismissing LGBT public events, the police was never acting alone. It was always because of, well, at least what they always said, that it was always because of pressure from other groups, which is basically the usual suspect. It's the Islamic Defender Movement or the Forum Umat Islam. All these fundamentalists Islamic fundamentalist groups. But what happened 2 weeks ago, it was actually police without any, they're acting alone. So, I don't know, I think, well, I'm going to give you a bigger picture of this. Well, in Indonesia, the fundamentalism has been increased in Indonesia, and we just had in Jakarta, we just had a local election in Jakarta, where a Christian and Chinese governor was not only defeated during the election, despite of the public 70% of public approval of his work, he was also imprisoned for blasphemy. So this local governor, this governor is a strong ally of our current president. So this administration started to realize the threat of the Muslim, the Islamic fundamentalist groups, because it started to really threatening their position. So the administration, the president, start to, what do you call it, a campaign against some organizations like the Hizb ut-Tahrir. They threatened to dissolve the Hizb ut-Tahrir in Indonesia. I don't know if it's popular. Hizb ut-Tahrir.
It used to be until it was banned, I think.
Yeah. Hizb ut-Tahrir, and then they also threatened to dismiss the Islamic Defender Front, and then the leader of this Islamic Islamic Defender Front is now a fugitive for pornography too, because this is also a question of private space. He was actually chatting with his mistress, and showing naked pictures and stuff, and then the police caught that. I don't know how they got the taxi, and then basically he's in Mecca now. He's in Mecca now, running away from the police. So there's a huge fight back from the administration towards the Muslim groups, if I could. So while the police has been a close friend to some of these Muslim groups, and it would be very hard for them to implement the order of the president while maintaining their relationship with, because some of these groups are also their attack dogs to avoid vertical conflict with the public. So the way I see it is that what they did with the raid, and then just few days after the raid, a police in a polda, a provincial police department in West Java announced that they will create a task force on LGBT party. Pesta LGBT, on LGBT, like a task force against LGBT. So the way I see it is that this is the police way of maintaining, of avoiding being stigmatized as secular.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is that's the way I see it. There's a political reason behind it, why the police has been cracking down the LGBT groups. Yeah.
But I've got more questions, but we've been going half an hour. Any questions from the floor at this point? Do ask, and then we can carry on talking a bit more. But if any of you have got things that you're not understanding or specific questions, then ask away. Yeah.
Hi, thank you both for being here. I wanted to ask about how the LGBT community perceives itself, because one of the themes that we're talking about is also queer. And why do you think that queer studies hasn't been taken up, or queer theory is not used, but instead this category and of LGBT? And what is the changes that are kind of taking place now in Indonesia in relation to the understanding of non-normative sexuality?
I think the discourse of queer theory, sexual diversity, were only popular among the, like, what do you call it, elite activists?
Yeah.
Like, even among activists, it is still a foreign concept. So I really don't know how to answer that. I think if we conduct, not if, but we have conducted surveys where many of LGBT living in rural areas still think that they're sinful, they're committing sins, because they are, most of them are Muslims, from Muslim families, and they think that they are sinful, despite of, their outward appearance. They still think if you ask them, even among some of the activists that I know, if you ask them, do you feel proud of yourself being a homosexual or being a transgender? They said, I'm just being myself, but I don't think God approves it. So yeah, I don't know if it answers your question, but well, I think that's about it.
Yeah, I think even perhaps not quite so much now in Indonesia, but until recently, there's even this use of the word sakit, which basically means ill.
Yeah.
And people will describe themselves as being ill, as a basically meaning they're gay or lesbian or of alternative sexuality or whatever. So it really is. It's really quite internalized to an extent, I'd say. But there's the I'm trying to remember the name of the survey. It begins with the Pew survey, and it's Indonesia comes out as 97% of the population disapproving of homosexuality. It's like in
93.
Is it 97 or 93? 93.
Yeah.
Okay, that's better. But there are, we can ask queries about how that research is conducted, and obviously comparing attitudes across this vast array of countries and so on. It's a difficult one, but nonetheless, 93% when asked. That's a remarkably high number. Yeah. When at the same time, until 2 years ago, everyone who was doing their research in Indonesia would have said, Indonesia's not a homophobic country.
Right.
It's a heteropositive country where you gain advantage through behaving heterosexually. But, people weren't being beaten up or attacked or whatever for the fact that they were, or very rarely, there were occasional incidents. Yeah. But, I felt much more, and I know a lot of friends would have felt much more at risk of their physical safety here in the UK than they would have done in Indonesia until a couple of years ago.
Gay basing is very rare,
so it's a very different type of but it's clearly extremely oppressive. And I think that's, there was one guy, Henry Julius, I guess we can talk about him. He's very interesting. He's a young man in Indonesia who's had education in Australia, and I think has recently done a master's degree in Australia as well. And he came back and suddenly he was saying, what on earth is all this queer theory I've just been learning? I've come back to Indonesia and then this is the reality. And how do I use that to deal with the basic oppression that everyone's having to go through in their day-to-day lives, and almost a mismatch between the theory that he'd really embraced and been excited about, and then the reality when he gets back to Indonesia, and what good is that in dealing with a really awful situation? Yeah. We've got lots of questions now. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you're finding that it's gay men who are most being targeted by the police, and if so, why you think that might be the case, like if it's because their behavior is just considered more important, or because just, yeah, in the media I've been reading mostly about attacks and raids and sentences toward gay men, but I know that other parts of the community are obviously being persecuted as well.
Okay, thank you. I bet you are Tamara, no? I received your email. So, yes, I think transgender women and gay men are, in terms of number of attacks, are, I can't say they are the most targeted, but if you look at the number of the case, these are many cases involve gay men and trans women. But I think it's all I think it has a lot to do with appearances, because it's easy to spot. It's easy to spot, or what is the political term for that? Politically correct term, like to recognize gay people and trans women from their outside appearances. Well, lesbian, like LGBT even, are not very physical, because in our culture in Indonesia, being tomboy is pretty acceptable. Many parents are very proud if they have like masculine daughters when they were still kids. It's a more acceptable phenomena rather than having a feminine boy. So I think it's got a lot to do with visibility rather than the, what do you call it, the gender importance of. But I could be wrong. I'm not a gender expert or academics on this, but that's how I see it. I think it's a lot to do. And then in Indonesia, women holding hands and walking down the streets are very, very acceptable. Like, it's very common. But some men are, sometimes they hug when on motorbikes. But I think, you know, we see that a lot. But the thing is that I think we have to separate. If you, from what I see is that no one ever acted alone in committing violence to it. Like, it's not like you're kissing on the street and then someone just, you know, like hit you. It's always a mobilized mob. It's never like, you mean in the US or in many European countries, you heard that, like, someone just, you know, bash you in the head just because you're parents. But it's not in Jakarta. They would rather steal your money rather than, you know, get thing. So, yeah.
Though I guess you could say, sort of from the, you know, the archive, that there are ongoing records of warrior being attacked.
Yeah.
But I guess that's quite often, you know, the extreme visibility, especially of warrior, so male to female, transgender, sex workers especially, and you know, so they're in a very exposed position, and that's not condoning it, but perhaps explaining why that type of violence, and you know, we see representations of that type of violence in films and newspaper stories and so on, going all the way back to the 1970s and so on. So I think that's always been there, hasn't it?
Yeah.
But I guess that too is more about exploitation of a situation rather than
rather than genuine sentiments or negative sentiments of the publics.
Another question? Who have we got? At the front in the red top there is like David Dimbleby.
Hello, I'm Yulia, and I'm happy to know that there is a talk about Indonesia because I'm Indonesian. I'm from Indonesia, and I've been living like for 1 year for my study. So like before I came to UK, then I also felt very difficult because like there was like the judicial review case raised by these groups called the coalition of Family
Love Alliance.
Family Love Alliance, who addressed this case of the to expand the zinas, the extramarital adultery, and also to include also like the same-sex relation. But I think this is part of the big escalation. I think when I reflect, is part of the. I mean, like after the decentralization, after the reformasi, after the post-authoritarianism, actually, like Indonesia wants to create a democratic space, which is like the civil society raised, and then like, there are many different voices, which is very important. But then in 2003, there is a decentralization, which is there are many discriminatory policy and also bylaws. So like we can identify like 4,021 discriminatory bylaws, including what happened in Aceh. So I mean that's one thing that we've been struggling, not only related to LGBT person only, but also about women's, because most of this law also targeted women's mobility, restrict the dress code. So it's very connected, like when we goes to the how the femininity, the masculinity is being interplayed in the public space. So I think it is very essential to raise that case. And I think the second one about the Aceh, I think Aceh is definitely is already unconstitutional, because we know like we have a legal pluralism. So, but actually like there are many law that implemented by Aceh, which is nationally is very contradictory, and in which the state, the national government even don't have capacity. Because the recent regulation about the pemerintahan daerah of the local governments, so there was also a petition from the local governments who said that the recent discriminatory bylaws cannot be revoked by the national level. So it's become another challenge, not only in regard to LGBT, but also for the others identities as well. So, I mean, like that's also the other context that we should recognize, and also the rising of the fundamentalists is part of that.
So, just because you've raised so many interesting things there, and there are two things in particular that I wonder if you can comment a little bit more on. The first is this Family Love Alliance, and the movement to criminalise extramarital sex, and this is something that's potentially, this is going through the courts at the moment?
The court and the parliament actually.
Yeah. So is it, in your opinion, is it realistic that this could become law? And I mean, my question is, how on earth would one even begin to try and enforce in Indonesia making extramarital sex illegal? So that's the first question. Yeah. And then my other question is just going to be the situation in Aceh with Sharia law and so on. So what many of us outside of it, and perhaps in Indonesia, were also asking was, why on earth, or is it not possible for the central government to just step in and do something? So if you can just, why couldn't they, or why didn't they, if you can answer that one as well?
Okay, thank you, Yulia, for the commentary. I think, as someone who took part in the student movement back then, during the transitional period of the authoritarian regime into the democratic system, it is painful for me to see that instead of that, like, the winner is not the democratic people, but the fundamentalist groups. They utilize democratic institutions and procedures to destroy democracy, basically. So that's what is happening now. And I think the family alliance is an evidence of that, where fundamentalist groups have successfully infiltrated many institutions. Not only the education, like schools or universities, where in Indonesia now it is common to see a jihadi extracurricular activity in high schools, because they have succeeded to infiltrate the system. They even infiltrated the agricultural department, so they can put their people to be not a consult, penyuluh, like educator for farmers. So instead of educating the farmers about crops, they educate them about the importance of the Khalifah. So that's why we have not been a very successful agricultural country. So this is what's happening now. This ILEA, it's when in many countries academics and activists are united, spreading this progressive ideas. In Indonesia, it happened the other way around. Conservative universities are filled with conservative academics, and they form this love family alliance. They're basically, their main focus they're focusing on criminalizing or eradicating any sexual conducts outside marriage, including LGBT. Of course, LGBT will always be homosexuality, because there's no way for us to get married. Yeah. So that's what is. That is what this alliance is aiming for. They're focusing on protecting the families.
And do you think
the family values?
Do you think this law is going to get through?
I think it's a 50-50 chance, I think, because it is very, there's a lot of supporting this law is giving a lot of advantages for politicians. Yeah. And these are politicians are lawmakers. So there's always there's a big chance that it will
get passed.
But some of them also realize that they will get a lot of backlash from activists, from CSOs. So according to the last deliberation, they decided to pending the discussion to a later meeting, to a later session. So I think they've been, well, Constitutional Court, I'm not really worried, because I'm not worried because they don't have the power to make the law, to create a new law. They can annul a certain law that conflict with the constitution, but they cannot create a law because it's not their jurisdiction. So, but what is going on in the parliament that I'm really worried about, because we are now in the process of amending our penal code, and this alliance really, and many groups are pushing towards the criminalization of casual sex and homosexuality. So
and the situation in Aceh, why could Jokowi not do something? Or why didn't he want to do something?
But when we talk about Aceh, we have to go back to 2006, because Aceh was it's a conflict. It's a region that has a very long history of conflicts, and the Syariah law is part of the peace accord, like the agreement between the national government and the Freedom Aceh movement at that time, that they can create, basically they can impose their own law, and it's always been a tricky situation. I'm not going to defend the government policy towards Aceh, but I think it's very hard for the government to go back into that issue again of saying that because and even not just the government, if you talk to local NGOs there, even the human rights NGOs, they will refuse to talk about this, because in Aceh, if you talk about decriminalization of this casual cohabitation or homosexuality, it's like you are against the Sharia law, you are against Islam.
Yeah.
So it will be hard for them. It's very hard for them to approach this issue by condemning the imposition of the law itself. So I think it's a different situation. But also I can see that there's a reluctance from the government to address the issue. I mean, Aceh is a different situation, but we have to remember there are also 421 discriminatory bylaws all over Indonesia, and they didn't do anything about it. And while they have more power to, of course, they cannot annul, they cannot revoke bylaws, but they can always. They can always do a lot of approaches to.
They can work behind the scenes.
Exactly.
And put some pressure on if they.
Exactly, but they don't. They don't. Even when they had the power, they didn't do it.
Any more questions? Oh, we've got. We'll carry on going in order 1, 2, and then 3. The chap at the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amira, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Family Love Alliance, and it just came across to me.
Oh, you're not a member of it, right?
No. So from what I understand, the persecution towards LGBT, I see that the Family Love Alliance, the cases brought by the Family Love Alliance is, I think the first time the persecution towards LGBT is based on family protection.
Yeah.
And from what I understand and to my knowledge, and previously the persecution was based more or less based on morality, and I wonder what has caused or what has influenced this shift. Thank you.
Sorry, for the alliance? Or
from what I'm trying to ask is that from what I understand from the case of Family Love Alliance, there has been a shift from persecuting LGBT based on morality to persecuting LGBT in order to protect the family values. So I'm wondering what has caused this shift.
I think it's always based on the morality of the family values. I mean, it's always, they always work, they always focus their work on family values, on upholding the morality of protecting the morality and the integrity of the family. So I haven't seen the shift actually in their movement, and this alliance, they are kind of separated with other vigilante groups. Like they don't persecute LGBT. Most of their works are through democratic institution. They lobby the parliament. They petition. They file petition through the constitutional court, but they don't like persecute, like go to the field and persecute LGBT. That's the work of the Islamic defender groups or the Hizb ut-Tahrir of the.
And this is the big difference, no?
They're a think tank.
Yeah,
they're
so,
more dangerous, actually.
Yeah, so previously it had been sort of violence and intimidation and so on, whereas now it's actually an attempt at a legal method to change the situation.
Exactly.
Yes. And we've got the question there, and then we've got the chap afterwards. And so let's respect the idea we're going to wrap up in the next 15 minutes.
I'll be quick, I promise. So thank you so much for coming here to share your fight. And it's been feel very touched hearing about these experiences. And in the effort to understand the LGBT situation in Indonesia, you've talked a lot about the G, and you touched on the L and B. And could you share some more about the experiences of trans people in Indonesia, especially trans women, trans men, and maybe non-binary people, if they feel safe there to express that gender?
Trans women are, I think, out of the LGBT groups, I think trans women are the most is the group who are most marginalized and discriminated, because and from our surveys we found that 38% of LGBT people in at least in 14 areas of 14 regions, they live below the poverty line, and extreme below the poverty line. But when it comes to trans women, the number gets to 94%, because it's impossible for them to get employed in a formal setting. They always, even in informal setting, it's also hard. So most of them are working on the street, being a sex worker or street singer, and many of them live on 500,000 rupiah per month. 500,000 rupiah, it's like
30 pounds.
30 pounds a month. So, and it's hard for them to access. We have this national health insurance system, but it's also hard for them. It's also difficult for them to access that, because the ID card doesn't show. It's not. It's, what do you call it? It's different to their actual appearance. So they cannot apply for that system, and they are very, very vulnerable to a lot of to many penyakit,
Illnesses,
disease. Sorry, diseases. So, and when they get sick, it's it's even harder to, I mean, it's expensive, and so it's like a vicious circle. For trans men, I think well, they have the same problem because it's hard for them to get jobs too. But yeah, you're right. We don't really have an actual, like I don't have actual information like data on their overall situation. But there are cases where trans men were being prosecuted because for falsifying documents, identity. So, yeah, intersex are, yeah, it's even more. I have no information about that. I think it's more invisible to detect, to identify. Yeah, because in Indonesia the common practice when you have when you are an intersex person, yeah. When you're intersex, your parents have to decide, since you are a young child, on your sex. So sometimes when they grow up, they don't even know what they used to be intersex, or they are intersex. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take the very last question there.
Thank you very much. My name is Chao Bang. I'm a writer and blogger, and I just wanted to ask you for your view on how you think the situation is going to develop from here on. It might be impossible to answer, but for example, you mentioned there's now more of a state backlash to these violent and intolerant groups, and of course the work of activists as well. Do you think this moral panic at the moment can be halted and will eventually subside? Or, given what you said about how deeply these groups have managed to infiltrate Indonesian society, how much of a risk do you think there is that these groups might actually gain an ascendancy? For example, do you think there's a risk that the direction that Aceh has been going in over the past few years might be replicated in other parts of the archipelago? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think to me, I think it's going to get worse from here. I think, well, looking at the situation now, even though the current administration is campaigning a fight back against fundamentalist groups, but this is not a strong administration. This is an administration with very weak alliance in the parliament as well. So, like, whatever the president said, that's not what is actually going to happen, because even the police don't always listen to him. So I think there's a strong, now currently there's also a strong mobilization among these Muslim groups, saying that, oh, this current administration is targeting on Muslim, it's a Islamophobic, can you believe that in Indonesia? There's an Islamophobic, this is an Islamophobic administration attacking the integrity of the Muslim community, and people actually buys it. So I think when it comes to LGBT community, we don't have a lot of support. We don't have support from the politician. We don't have support from the public, because they see us as dangerous group. Even the military consider the military. This is the statement from the Panglima, the chief commander? No,
Yeah.
Panglima Abri is the chief commander is the president's.
Is it like a general or something?
Like
What is it?
chief of joint military
Chief of Joint Military Forces.
said that. Yeah, he said like he basically said this is this LGBT propaganda is a proxy war. It's a proxy wars of the Western countries trying to undermine the integrity and the sovereignty of our nation. That they consider the LGBT community as a threat to the national security. And like the craziest thing you've heard, like just when I thought I've heard everything, and there comes this. So I think I'm very pessimistic towards the situation. When you ask what is my my view on this. So, but I think this is even among LGBT community, there's a strong reluctance of advocating the issues, of advocating the rights. When Arus Pelangi tried to, we went to the press council to make the Islamic conservative media to make a public apology, and we condemn many public officials for condemning LGBT community. Many LGBT, many of the community, part of the community, members of the community, really criticizing us, saying that it's not a wise thing to attack these people, and we shouldn't be really seen, really visible to the public. So yeah, I think it's the hardest time for LGBT rights advocacy movement in Indonesia, and I think and I think it's going to last a while before it gets better.
Yasmin, we've run out of time. We've run out of time and ended on what's rather a depressing note. But sometimes life is sad and depressing, and it's necessary to end on such notes. But I would like to say...
There's always a hope.
There's always hope. Yasmin is talking again tomorrow morning, as part of a panel. Yeah. So we'll be talking much more about activists and so on across Asia generally. So do come and hear Yasmin again tomorrow. And it's really just to say thank you very much to all of you for coming.
Thank you for coming,
to listen to Yasmin. But most of all, thank you very much indeed to Yasmin for coming here.
Thank you, Ben, for having me. Thank you for having me. Thank you.